All right, guys, welcome back to the Untitled Fitness Podcast. Today I have Matt Cronin on. I think it was last year, actually, around the same time that we had you on, already to talk about programming pretty in depth for the different lifts, squat, bench, and deadlift. And this one is going to be a little bit more focused around troubleshooting programming issues that a lot of athletes face because something that I think that, is the biggest thing that experienced coaches like Matt have is a really wide toolbox, knowing how to troubleshoot different issues with powerlifting when they arise and really allow athletes to keep progressing even well into the advanced or elite phases of their training career. So wanted to thank Matt for coming on again. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this discussion.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So I guess just diving right into things, we're talking about troubleshooting and adjusting programming. The first issue I wanted to talk about is athletes who feel like their bottom end, lower percentages feel really, really strong. But when they get to their top end intensities, say 85 plus percent, that starts to feel like pretty heavy and kind of detrained. And usually these lifters are people that, if they're doing like a high rep set, they will indicate a higher E1 or M than what they can actually express for singles. So as far as programming, what would you do to help address this issue?
So I think the root cause that I would, view there is just an issue with exposure and exposure to that 85 plus percent or whatever that sort of like ceiling might seem to be at that time. And how you go about increasing that exposure, I think can come across in many different ways. It can come across as in somewhere else in the training week, you have to touch something around that or above that, kind of arbitrary number, percentage, whatever it is, to sort of bridge the gap between like 1 week's, assumedly or presumably like primary session to another week's primary session. So doing something on, your second squat day or bench day or whatever it is that gets you to get a little bit more exposure with that skill, because I sort of think of these things as similar to, like, I always use the analogy of like free throws. They're basically free throws, but with a very large fatigue, kind of cost attached to it in comparison. And that's the skill that needs to be brushed up, and it needs to be looked at, and it needs to be trained, is how well you are performing at that 85 plus percent. So that would be the main thing that I would look at, kind of adjusting there is how do we get this lifter exposed to this more often, whether it's through rep sets or singles or whatever the case is. So yeah, I think that's probably answers like the base question. I know we got a couple more that kind of, touch on the same thing. So I don't know how much more you want me to go in depth there, or just kind
I
of wait
mean,
until we go into
I think just like going over that, one question that I have is, as far as different lifts, I think that's, calling it primer sets. And you were kind of, saying that, might be like a single or whatever, like, because it's, basically what you're saying is that they get detrained by the time it comes around to their next primary day. So they just need some heavier intensity exposure. Do you think it matters if it's like a specific load on the barbell, or is it like more like needing like a higher RPE set on that other day, or is it more so the absolute load needs to be high enough? It doesn't really matter like the RPE of the set.
That's a good question, and I don't know if I quite have the exact answer for it. I think that's a athlete to athlete sort of case dependent thing. I think I would start with, if we're having an athlete come in and let's say like on the intended session where things aren't feeling good at that top end, if the exposure we're trying to give them is a single, just more for the sake of like novelty and more for the sake of like not doing the same thing all the time, I might have on that other session a double or a triple, with a, maybe moderate or higher RPE, depending on the lifter, what lift it is, what they can recover from, so on and so forth. And it might be the other way around. If, we're kind of failing with more rep stuff, if you're giving this lifter a triple on the primary day and it's not really panning out and going well, I might give them a single on that other, secondary session or whatever it might be, because that will expose them to that certain intensity, whatever the case is. So I think it that just kind of ties into fatigue management, because with some lifters, having them do a higher RPE set somewhere else in the week might just be too much. But for some lifters, that might be exactly what they need. So for instance, actually, I can pull up. I just had this recently with a lifter that I coach. So this lifter, he's been a power lifter for a pretty long time, but he took a bit of a break from really focusing on it, and he was an equipped lifter. And we had only done one raw meet together in the time that we worked together, but we were kind of running into a pretty similar issue where he was doing on like Monday just an ascending 3x5 squat, and we would kind of cap it out around like 7 or 6.5, 7 RPE or so. And his primary session was like a top set somewhere around like 3 to 5 reps at the time, and then a couple back off high bar sets, like some higher rep, 3x7 in the block I'm looking at type of thing. And we were just finding that he wasn't really feeling great on that top end. Like every time he was going into his primary day, like the bar was feeling heavy on his back, stuff like that. So I went with a little bit more of an aggressive approach. And I think sometimes it can be nice to try and like find that sort of line as quick as you can of like, all right, like where is the limit of how much we're able to push this secondary session? And then you can always sort of peel it back from there. It just depends how quickly you want to get there and how, durable the athlete is. So the very next block, on his secondary session, that Monday session where he was doing that ascending 3x5, I pretty much just bumped the RPEs up 1 across all the ascending sets from what he would normally do, and I added 1 back off set. So it's a pretty intense day. For some people that may be, well over the line of too much, or it might just be a little bit too much, whatever. But that ended up working perfectly for him, and his performance, kind of jumped up quite a bit. All of those sort of subjective symptoms he was dealing with of the bar feeling really, really heavy and feeling clunky, all those things kind of went away. So in that case, it was more of a intensity thing. We added the intensity at the top end, and we also did add a little bit more volume as well. He is a little limited in terms of schedule. So like I try in a case like that to not force someone to have to do like super high frequency squatting. Not that 3 times is super high frequency, but it's high, probably the highest that most people will go. So I wanted to see if we could, do something with the 2 days before we looked at, jumping up to a 3rd day. And that's what we ended up doing. And so far it's worked out really, really well. So that's like a prime example of that.
I think something that's like also interesting going off of that, with the I found that personally, like one thing that really affects that and how heavy you might need to go on a secondary day is proximity of the secondary day to your primary day or the last session that you just did. Because I've had experiences on my squat, for example, where I've given myself more recovery time in between my secondary squat and my primary squat, and it feels clunky. It doesn't feel strong. I don't have like any pop in my legs or whatever. And then just adding in like a belt squat day as like the 3rd day, like it's light, just getting some general movement that brings me back around, or just placing the secondary squat session closer for me, and that's enough to really help it get more. So I'm feeling really good again on squats.
Yeah, I think I think it just goes to show there's like more than one way to kind of get to where you want to go. Speaking personally, like I was working, Steve Denoe was my coach for a couple of years, like probably from sometime, I think right around when COVID started up until somewhat recently, and like back in March. And he was an excellent coach. I'm not saying I don't work with him anymore because he's not amazing, but I needed a break from powerlifting, and I basically told myself I'm going to take as much time as I need or want to just sort of like train how I want to. Granted, I was still doing like high bar squatting, I was still benching, whatever. And that also meant like I'm going to change my schedule around to a way that makes the most sense for my life, where powerlifting isn't at the highest forefront of my priorities. And then I got the itch for powerlifting again and wanted to come back to it. I, kind of wrote up my own training block and have been back at it for like 8 or so weeks now. And when I was working with Steve, he had me on this Monday, Wednesday, Saturday squat split that worked really well, and it was going over nicely. And then when I went and took the reins myself, I was like, I don't frankly really want to squat 3 days a week, and I don't want to train on the weekends because my girlfriend is in school and we don't spend a lot of time during the week, so I want to have the weekends off. So I'm now squatting on Monday and Thursday, and I might be doing a little bit more work on like one of the sessions, but just the distance from those 2 days, because before, like I said, it was like Monday, Wednesday, Saturday. Now it's a Monday, Thursday, kind of just like splitting the difference between the 2 and the 3 in terms of like the spacing of the days. And it's worked out great. And squat is going really, really well. I wouldn't say it's going better than when I was working with Steve and doing 3 days a week, but it's definitely not going worse. And I'm feeling good and I'm enjoying training. And, I think, like I said, that goes to show there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of get to where you want to go. And with that lifter I was just talking about, I think we could have added a third session in there and gotten the same thing out of it. But in his case, to me, it didn't make the most sense. He trains 4 days a week. He benches 3 days a week. He's, deadlifting twice. He's squatting twice. And if you just kind of do the math on that, it's like you're going to end up having to do a lot of, big barbell compound movements across all of your days. And it may not leave a whole lot of room for, other things that you want to do accessory wise, or things that you just find are fun or whatever the case is. So for him, pushing the intensity on that day just kind of seemed to help more, because what I had come to the conclusion of, or what I sort of guesstimated, is that he was doing his Monday session and it just wasn't enough work. It wasn't enough stress to carry him to Thursday. So I was like, I don't think we need to push, giving you a single on this day in order to make Thursday go better. I think we just need to push this day harder in general with what we're already doing. So like I said, we added a set, brought the RPE up, and that's kind of worked like a charm for him. And it's not to say that maybe what we were talking about won't happen in the future or won't be needed in the future, but for now, that was like the lowest kind of intrusion way that I could get to like where I wanted to go without, throwing a big wrench in his training program or making him squat 3 days a week.
Right. I would also argue like that 3 days a week squat is probably like a bigger change in general than just, trying to increase the stress, the workload, or the intensity on one day. But I think going off of that, general lack of pop and explosiveness. This is something that, maybe the lifter comes in, they're just like, they just get under the bar and like they feel like they are well practiced, but like there's no explosiveness. It just kind of feels like they're moving in slow motion.
So, I mean, that's sort of where things start to get a little bit tricky, because I think for some lifters, if you're not wildly experienced, or not wildly, but not very experienced, it can be hard to discern like, okay, I don't feel like I have a lot of pop. I don't feel super strong. Maybe particularly when things get heavy. Is it because, we're coming in and we're just detrained to that skill we were talking about? Or is there maybe not fatigue that you feel from like a, wow, I'm sore perspective, but, like a neurological thing or whatever the case is, like where, you just might be a little bit fried coming into that day. Sometimes that can be a little bit hard to discern. And you have to look at, I think, like, how are things moving proportionally to, one another? If the lifter looks like decently strong, but everything just kind of looks like it's moving a little bit on the slow side or a little bit on the, I guess just, yeah, like you said, no pop, slow side, whatever. And they don't feel like super weird or clunky or anything like that. I might assume that they could be doing a little bit too much, or maybe they're kind of being exposed to a certain intensity or a certain like rep range or whatever a little bit too often, potentially on that day or somewhere else. I think that this one could be super, super loaded, because we got, rep range sensitivities that you can go over, because we see some lifters where you just do heavy stuff too much, or you do high rep stuff too much or whatever, and you just start to regress, even if like all other variables are being equated, just because that's not where you seem to thrive. And then you could look at it from just the perspective of, are you coming in kind of that over recovered sort of deal, the detrained sort of deal, or are you coming in fatigued, understimulated, whatever. So I think that opens kind of a big can of worms in that case. But if we haven't made any big changes to stuff that, like, generally speaking, works normally, I'm always going to end up looking first at like the preceding session. I think that's where I always start is, if we're looking to make a primary day go a certain way and it's not how we want it to go, I'm always going to try to look at the session that comes right before it, for that lift. So if it's a bench or a squat or a deadlift, obviously how often you're doing them is going to be variable. But what can we change about that day that comes prior to make this one go a little bit better? Do we need to add a little bit more work to that day? Do we need to take away a little bit of work to that day? Do we need to make it more intense? Do we need to make it a lower repetition? Do we need to make it higher repetition? Those are kind of the questions that I kind of start to ask myself when trying to troubleshoot, that sort of thing. Because I think if a lift is like not on the right track, I always just try and like focus in on one day to start. Like, all right, how do we make this one day go really well? And then we can start kind of building it out from there. So we can get this one on the right track, then we sort of know where to go, and ideally have a little bit more of a roadmap to work with to make the other days, go a little bit better. So those are sort of the variables that I would, immediately look at.
Yeah, I think with this one you have to look at other things like how does their technique feel when they're lifting? Like, do they feel like they're well practiced, and like they just feels really heavy, and just they have like that lack of explosiveness, probably maybe a little bit too much work, or maybe there's too much exposure to that, to a similar rep range, and they need more variation throughout the week. For example, that's what I found with like my bench press, is that it just needs to be all over the place with my programming. Even though I only bench twice a week, it's like I can't be in a similar rep range on both days and be strong. And also, just asking yourself, do they feel like they're actually getting, like, do they feel like they're strong on that day, but there's like a lack of explosiveness? Usually that would lean to being like a little more over recovered, versus do they feel sore, or do they kind of
Yeah.
just feel like I don't really want to train? Like I can still hit this weight, but definitely holding on to some fatigue. I mean, one thing I point to there is always like how I feel. I like the end of like a prep, like when I'm really strong. I don't feel great coming in, but I'm still really strong, and
Yeah.
that could just be like cumulative fatigue. But I think a big factor too is how fast are you ramping up weights? Like, are you starting off too heavy? That could literally be like the main thing there. Um,
Yep.
or is that secondary day just too heavy, and then you have more of that gap in intensity? And the thing that's tough about this is that it's so different between all of the three lifts. In general, deadlift is going to lean a little bit more towards lower intensity on the secondary day, less work. Squat, it's kind of right in the middle. It just
Yep.
depends on leverages and just in general. And similarly with bench press, but usually it's hard to really troubleshoot. I think also like looking over past training data that the client might have or past experiences could. So yeah, that's kind of my perspective on it.
Yeah, you added something that we actually just talked about, between us at, Powerlifting Now. We, if we're ever like kind of stumped on something or whatever, we'll kind of talk to each other and like get each other's ideas. And one of the guys was talking about a client that they've been running a very, very similar, kind of block setup or whatever for quite a while, and they've made a ton of progress with this lifter on the lift that they're talking about. And then just sort of like out of nowhere, just everything just plummets down and like isn't really working the way that it has in the past. And I think the biggest sort of like hurdle that we kind of have to get over, or we have to be ready for in like our modern styles of programming, where we're very often trying to just do what will give us the best return on our investment as much as we possibly can to get as strong as we reasonably can within like the shortest span of time. I think that's how like a lot of really successful coaches are programming in like the modern era. The biggest thing that we run into, I think, is that there sometimes isn't enough novelty in programming. And I always kind of make the joke, like everything comes back to Louis Simmons, because it kind of does. But he always talked about like the law of accommodation, which is basically just saying like if you do something for too long, your body kind of just gets used to it, and the reward you get from that stimulus gets lesser and less over time, and could eventually, I'm not going to say it will, but could eventually turn into now you're just not going anywhere, or you might even start to regress or whatever. And I think we need to kind of like keep the spirit of what training structure looks like for a lifter if things are going well, but then they start to kind of get a little bit stale, and figure out a way to like inject novelty into it without blowing it up, without changing it from a structural perspective or standpoint or whatever. And when you mentioned that about your bench, that was something that, kind of struck me, because I think we'll often be troubleshooting when someone runs into the wall, and we may not have a super clear idea of exactly what they need. We have an idea, and we'll try it out, and maybe it doesn't work, so we add a little bit more, or we do whatever, and we end up getting to this point where now things start to go well, and I question, is it because we just are doing something a little bit different now? You know, we added a couple of sets, sure, but that is novel for you. That's not necessarily like you were detrained before. Maybe it's just like a bump in volume is kind of giving you that little bit of push that you haven't had in a while, or whatever the case is. So I think that novelty is something that I've been thinking about a lot, over the last like week or two since we had that conversation, um, amongst us four. And yeah, just I thought it was a interesting thing to throw in, considering we don't really talk about novelty too much, I think, in our modern era of programming, and like how we kind of go about things and whatnot.
Well, I think one of the things that my friend Brendan Tappan and I have been talking about, who's very well known US coach in Michigan, is having like a gold standard split where we have like our prime out training volume that that we respond really, really well to. We're pushing things a bit harder. We have like our off season training just looks like it's a little bit scaled back as far as that. Maybe we're cutting one less set or two less sets on the primary day. We're doing a little bit more accessory volume to fill in that gap. Instead of like changing the entire structure of like what has worked well in the past, because I think that's more of a general risk for, especially as people get more and more advanced. I think if you're a beginner, it's like the more novelty, it's like less of a risk. But if you get to like, a level where you're hitting a 500 dots, you stray too far away from what got you there. It could be really, really hard to like even like get back to that point, because you might even regress a decent amount. And for myself personally, like I've found that for myself, this is like what really, really helps keep me healthier. Is that what Eric and I will have started to do, and what we looked like in the past when I got really strong last year was we kind of had that push and pull. We're like in the volume phase, quote unquote, was Eric likes going back and forth between like a higher rep block and then a lower rep, higher intensity block. That's kind of how he prefers to periodize things. We would do like higher reps, less sets on my comp lists, and then do like maybe a little bit extra accessory volume, and then we would cut that accessory volume and exchange that for lower RPE down set work. And I seem to respond really, really well to that. It keeps me really healthy, because if I, especially like, my bench press, for example, like I have a history of just getting hurt. Like I can get strong, but I get hurt, and I can't push that workload very, very high consistently. And that's what I've also found to work really, really well. So that's just a personal anecdote. And I've done that with more of my clients recently, like coming out of meets and just kind of like going back and forth between that. It's like, in my mind, if you can still make progress or like maintain progress on a lower workload, shit, when you go back to what you know that you can still recover from, and we know how much of a big deal volume is, you're probably going to see a pretty big boost once you get adapted to that higher workload.
Yeah, exactly. Because now it's novel. You've taken the time away from it. And now there's a level of novelty introduced when you bring back that extra workload, versus if you just do it the whole way through. Maybe if you do all the math on it and you're able to see the future, maybe it ends up being the same. But it also gives the lifter this period of time where they're like, oh, like I'm really excited about training because things are going really well. And if one guy puts 5 pounds on his total every month for 12 months, and then one guy puts 10 pounds on his total every month for 6 months, the math works out the same. And nobody really cares how quickly or how slow you made that progress when they look at open powerlifting. But if it keeps the lifter a little bit more, kind of entertained with their training, or keeps them healthier because they're not pushing as hard for as long, then I think that's a huge win-win. And that kind of staggered approach, I do something not exactly similar, but what I'll do with especially lifters that are stronger, moving bigger loads on squat and deadlift, is I'll take this sort of staggered approach. And it could be one of two ways, where we either kind of offset pushing the squat and the deadlift block by block, or we'll do them at the same time if they can get away with that. But essentially, I'll keep the rep range the same for two training blocks, and the first one, might peak out at RPE 7.5, or something like that. And then the next block will, try and essentially like milk out that rep range to the end, hit a RPE 9 top set or whatever at the end of it. And then we'll move down. And that was something I actually, if I'm remembering correctly, I kind of stole from Marcellus through a conversation we had on our podcast, I believe. And that's been a nice way to, kind of keep the wheels on a little bit longer for stronger lifters who, you may hit a RPE 9 set of deadlifts for, a triple or set of 5 or whatever. And that may take you 2 weeks to recover from. And if you immediately jump into a next block and all you do is bring the reps down and you kind of match the RPEs, those first 2 weeks could be pretty shitty. And they may be like feeling pretty rough. And you may just kind of find that they're only able to kind of do like every other block is where they're able to push just naturally, because they're essentially taking half the block to recover from that big set that you hit. And when I say recover, it's not like you can't go and deadlift next week, but for anyone who may be listening, being like, oh, what do you mean you can't recover for 2 weeks? More so like how soon after you hit that really heavy set are you ready to, do something similar to that again, performance wise? It's probably not going to be for a little bit for, a lot of deadlifters or whatever the case is. So yeah, kind of similar idea, difference in execution, but yeah, like one block you push hard, one block you kind of, back off a little bit, like you said, maybe push your higher rep stuff a little bit more or push your accessory work a little bit more. And then you kind of, revert back to a heavier push. And especially, can you remind me how old you are, Adam?
26.
Okay, so we're the same age. We're not old or anything like that, but I've been powerlifting since I was like 15, and I think about what I was able to do then and what I'm able to do now, and it looks very, very different. Even if it means I'm doing better now, the approach has to be a little bit more, fine tuned and just not stupid, pushing, run through a wall the whole time.
Right.
And I think, as we get older, we probably realize we have to do that a little bit more, for whatever, degree of reasons. But anyway, that's a
Well,
whole
I, I
other
think I
topic.
think I think an important point there is like with the whole pulling back. I think a really important thing is just waiting until like you actually like kind of just feel good and like training is in like a rhythm. Because if some lifters it takes longer for them to like cook during their
Yes.
training blocks. I think this is really where you find those bigger jumps working better for a lot of lifters is they just start off really light, they keep it pretty light, and they can make a massive jump into week 4 once their adaptations or the peak week is once their adaptations hit because they just take that much time to like feel better. In fact, that was really what happened to me on my last block of bench after like a year of trying to like rebuild. It's been like 8 months. So I hit like 369 in training, and I finally got it again. But like my jumps literally were 314, 331, 342, then randomly 369. Like was just there. And I've seen that with a lot of my blocks that have gone really well. Is that it's like I just keep really light. I just kind of just have things move fast, and then all of a sudden that last week I'm like, holy crap, I can add 50
Yep.
pounds and I feel just as good. And I think that's one of the things that holds back a lot of people, like I end up talking about myself, especially. I love lifting heavy so much. That's why I love bodybuilding training because it rewards me more when I push hard.
Yeah.
Powerlifting training, well, especially once you get stronger, you get more time experience under the bar. You're not adapting as fast. You just can't do that, man. And like I'm gonna have to restart my block because like I try to be John Hack and I'm not John Hack.
Yeah, you get to have, like I kind of jokingly say, like I get to have like one fun session per lift per month, kind of thing. And the rest of it is sort of like doing the work so I can have that fun session and like really, take it to the limit or whatever, whatever it is. And yeah, it's that's definitely something that I think a lot of people sort of learn about themselves as time goes on, is like maybe you don't program like your RPEs or your percentages or whatever with less like extreme linearity from like week to week. I have definitely a couple lifters that like their block may go like at 5, at 6, at 6.5, at 7 or 7.5, and then at 9 for the last one, because that's when that adaptation period kind of occurs. And you notice there's like smaller jumps for the first, 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. And then boom, they're sort of like at that peak of, that training block just naturally through what we found. And then that's the time that you really kind of let loose. And there's people who are less extreme on this, and then there's people who are much more extreme. I've got a lifter named Dylan, and Dylan, he's definitely got longer training blocks. We've been doing like 6-week long training blocks for quite a while now, and like he'll start his deadlift training block for like 200 kilos for like a triple, and he'll be like, man, like deadlifts feel super bad, and like I forgot how to deadlift, and same thing week 2, and then he gets to week 4 and like he'll hit like 265 for a triple, or 270 for a triple, and he'll just be like, I feel so locked in, so dialed in. And that's just like, I just kind of call that like the slow cooker. You just kind of got to get in the crock pot and just like let it marinate for a little bit, not sweat it too much. Because if I were like seeing that first 2 weeks and like he's telling me he feels bad, I might panic and might want to make changes to that if I don't have that sort of, kind of data in the back pocket of being like, nope, this is just Dylan, this is Dylan's body just being Dylan's body. And by the time we hit week 4, he's going to feel totally different, and that just kind of correlates with like, especially if you're doing a meet, like needing to time when you start a training block and end a training block appropriately, especially for a guy like that. So yeah, those bigger jumps, can definitely work really, really well. Especially once you start to get stronger and move some bigger weights.
Yeah, it's always an interesting discussion for me with here, because I do think this is so different between lifters as far as like adaptation rates and like when they feel good and how much better do they actually feel on their week 4s. I do think one of the things I like Marcellus saying is like, you don't really need to go that heavy to set yourself up for like a next week of training, especially like a last block. Especially as you get stronger, the reality is that, he made this point about Lucky, is that like the absolute loads that he's lifting makes it look like his jumps are a lot bigger than they actually are. Because like him going from like a
percentage of 1RM is small.
Exactly. Yeah, because if he's going from like a 670 deadlift to 750, that's like 10%. Yeah. And whereas if you have a smaller lifter, it's like 270 to like 300. That seems reasonable. All of a sudden on paper, I think that just really being able to like identify those trends, and also just experimenting with different things, and then like once you find something that works, like, that I felt really good on week 4. One of the things I've found and this is a mistake I make in some of my lifters, and something that I admittedly made this mistake as a coach too. They might feel really, really strong. I know that Steve mentioned that someone is like how to like progress video. They feel really strong on their week 1 because they're still holding on to some of that fitness from their week 4. Yeah. And then they don't take enough weight off the bar, and they're like, I'm just really strong. We should just, I feel like crap. And that block is kind of toast. That happens so often. And the really powerlifting at a high level is understanding, how do we create that training momentum? Then how do we maintain it? And being okay with being like, okay, I might feel stronger on this day, but that's actually really, really good. Like I'm going to slightly undershoot a little bit here, because I'm only concerned about my week 4 and ramping into that week 4, because you don't need to be strong all the time maximally. Because I think once you get in the mindset of like that week 4 is what matters, especially with realities, like, but that's what we're doing anyways in programming. Like I think a whole new reality of peaking now, and how people taper into meets is, what's your block length? You put your taper week on that peak week that normally would be. That's way more predictable versus the old way of trying to maintain the adaptation for a week. Like it can't happen. I've done it several times, but it's like less reliable.
It's a little more roll of the dice for sure.
Yeah. So you guys should mention one.
Sorry, go ahead.
Going like you're good. Like one thing I wanted to go over is like, this kind of leads into one of the topics I wanted to just discuss too, about like letting lifters auto-regulate like full bore, like versus giving them like ranges and specific jumps, because I feel like this is something that is so important as you get more advanced. So how do you determine like what is appropriate for a lifter?
So sort of the process that I go through if I get a new lifter is I go through what I call like the quote unquote like discovery block. And this sometimes might last more than one block, but basically my idea is like, I'm going to kind of set up the training block that I really estimate will be like the right amount of, intensity, all the things we would normally do in a training block. But I'm really kind of throwing darts at the wall in an estimated fashion and just sort of making note of what happens. And I'll try to sort of extract as much information about this lifter as I can during that time, especially if a lift goes well. If a lift goes well, I'm going to pay a lot of attention to like, okay, what did the jumps look like? What were the average RPEs of like all of their, back offsets and stuff like that. And then as time goes on, try and, reference that, and then notice changes that happen over time naturally. And, eventually, your 15th training block probably doesn't really look all that similar to your discovery block, but it can be a great way to kind of set the foundation well. And one of the things that I make note of is I really don't in most cases, give lifters ranges, caps, anything like that in that first like 1 or 2 blocks, because I want to see how do they pace it. And then I want to see what is the result of that. And if I feel like the result is lackluster, I'll try to give them a little bit more guidance and say, okay, I think here's where we need to, either take it easier or we need to push it more or whatever the case is. And if things go really well, I'm going to sort of match what I see. I have this one lifter I can think of, his name's Chris, and he, for like most of his, 5-week training block on squat, like he feels not great. But in the 5th week, he just always comes to life and does really well. And I've had periods of time where I like try to, not intentionally, obviously, but like I realized looking back, like, oh, I try to make him fit into a box of like what sort of like you should do from like week to week in terms of jumps, right? Like, oh, 15 pounds a week, here are your ranges. We're going to increase those ranges 15 pounds. And he might hit his first week, and then his second week only jumps like 5 or 10 pounds. And then the same thing for his third week. And then he starts to make those big jumps. And that's a lifter where I almost entirely let him pace things himself, but I will make note of, okay, like what are the loads he's hitting, and sort of like how do I give him an RPE that kind of more or less keeps him in that realm. So the way that we pace his RPEs might look a little bit different, or for a lifter like that might look a little bit different. But for him, I'm almost entirely always letting him pace it himself. Whereas for other guys, where if we push it too much, either we burn out too fast, or maybe we start to run into fatigue management issues, then that's how I ultimately decide, how to pace that. I guess just to draw another example, was actually another lifter I work with. His name's Ryan, and we tried something new somewhat recently that ended up not going over super well. He's had a history of just like nagging knee pain, nothing super crazy, just like tendonitis type of things. And he squats twice a week, and I've always paced his like secondary day incredibly light, or like I've always kind of held it back and given him decent jumps, maybe like 20, 25, 30 pounds, something like that. But he's, at this point, like a 550 for 4, I think was the set he hit last block, or triple, excuse me, that he hit last block. So that kind of gives you an idea of where his strength is. And I would cap out his secondary day at like 455 for a triple in week 3, and then let him push it a little bit more in week 4. And he was like, hey, how do you feel about like sort of letting me push this a little bit earlier, a little bit sooner? And we tried it, and like immediately within like 2 weeks, his knees were kind of acting up. And, he made a start, instead of starting at like 405 and then going like 435, 455 and then 500 on a secondary day, he did something like 435, and then he hit 475 in his second week, matched 475 in his week 3 because he didn't feel that great, and then 485 in his week 4. And we were like, this is, kind of all the proof we need that keep like really kind of pacing this day very light, and just giving you one week where you're able to kind of push it a little bit more makes the most sense for like the fatigue management side of things. So that's a great example of like where I would choose to use that. It's really like those ranges, are there to either hold a lifter back if they're wanting to be a little bit too aggressive, or push that lifter, because you're giving them a minimum that you need them to hit if they're maybe like a chronic undershooter, which frankly I don't run into that often. Most people want to, push it more than they don't. And then there's those people who pace it really well, and I don't really feel like I always need to, give them those ranges or give them that guidance for that pacing, because they've kind of got it figured out. And whether it's intuitive or them just like listening to what their body is telling them, I trust them enough, and it's working out where I don't need to do that. And then if that changes, it changes, and we can decide to introduce those back. So those are the main reasons that I give ranges, caps, whatever, and sort of look to control the pacing a little bit more, if needed.
So let's say if the lifter was, you kind of realize, let's say like week 2, they're already a little bit overly aggressive, overshooting, a little bit heavier than you wanted. Is that a scenario where you would say, no, we can still salvage the block? Maybe you make some audibles with like the intensity for like the next week, or would you say probably best to just like restart the block? Like how important is like that? There's those early like couple weeks of like momentum building, or do you think like it doesn't matter a ton as long as you get like it under control enough in time?
So, I mean, I think that just in general, the building of momentum is like, that is the like crux of what I think we're trying to do with training blocks. It's, you know, when we're starting off, it's like, hey, don't force, you know, a square peg into a round hole. Like, let your body determine like what you're going to put on the bar today. You know, don't force anything to be there. Just sort of like take what is there. And I think if you are prescribing the sort of like right dosages of stuff, the right, you know, intensities, whatever, um, when they do that, they'll get the positive reward from it. And then later in the block is when you can tell them, hey, get a little bit more aggressive with it and, you know, push it and whatever. But I think that early stage of the block is ultimately probably more important than what you do later in the block, despite the differences that you see in like bar loads and such. Now, I think what you asked kind of depends. One, like how long is this lifter's training block? If they're doing it in week 2 and you're in week 4, or you're in a 4-week block, excuse me, might be tough to salvage that. And I also think it depends like what day are they doing it on. If they're like really pushing it too hard, in the case of like the lifter I was talking about before, Ryan, like he's pushing it too hard on a secondary day and now his knees blow up, and then, you know, we're struggling to get through that primary session with the same, you know, bravado, I guess, that we normally would. That might be a case where I say like, hey, we just need to peel back, you know, some degree of workload this next week, you know, through maybe your secondary day a little bit, and we'll peel back some of your volume on your primary day, and hopefully use that to try to get you back on track for your final week. And in some cases, if they just gun it too hard, too fast, like despite what you do, you may not get that sort of end result that you're really, really looking for. So it might be worth it in some cases to restart the block if they did it across like all the lifts. That's not something that I very often do. I really only do that if like life kind of screws things up a whole lot and we're not like on a strict schedule for like competition. Because when a lifter signs up for competition, I always am like setting up a calendar essentially and like planning out, okay, how many blocks do we have? How many sort of odd weeks do we have left over that we need to figure out what we're going to do with in order to like make sure that we go into this meet well? And, you know, I'll often ask like, okay, you're competing in 4 months, like, and we have these like 2 weird weeks left over. Like, are you happening to go on vacation at any time? Because then maybe that will be the time that we sort of get those out of the way, sort of thing. So if we're not doing any competition, maybe we start it over. But if it's really only for one lift, I'll say like, hey, you know, we might have kind of screwed the pooch on this a little bit, but let's put our eggs into the, you know, the other 2 lifts baskets and just kind of put this on autopilot a little bit for right now. If you feel good in the last week, you can go for it. I don't anticipate that you're going to feel that good. So, you know, just phone it in when you get there, if that's the case. And then, you know, ultimately kind of go from there. And if a lifter is doing that often, that's, you know, again, where those ranges and sort of the pacing from my end is going to come into, you know, into play.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm not afraid to just like to probably just like restart the block, especially like if they're starting to like take YOLO singles. I'm like, yeah, we're just gonna restart the block now because you didn't train
I mean,
responsibly.
in that case, I'll just tell people, I'm like, you're not doing my program. Like, I don't know
Yeah,
what program you're doing. It's not mine, you know? And especially if you have a chronic overshooter too, like that's another way to make them be like, oh shit. I had a lifter recently who, you know, failed a bunch of bench sets like over the course of a month, or like was grinding out bench sets that were not anywhere near prescribed, like the RPE that they were doing them at. And I had to tell this lifter, I was like, hey, just so you know, that's not my program. I don't know what program you're doing, but that's not mine. And I think there's a small thing inside of every person when they hear that, where they go, oh, fuck, he's right.
yeah.
And then
I think
sometimes that's enough to kind of get them on track. But
something that is, you know, is like people, and I do this too, is like I'm like, oh, I deadlift the 722 pounds. Surely this is always the case. Like that's how my deadlift is going to
yeah,
be always. It's like, no, I get really fatigued where like it's like 683 will be like my max on like a week 1 and a week 2. And then like I can maybe pull 694. Then it's like, oh, really? They jump into like a week 4, and just like understanding that and having data and just like being okay with those fluctuations and performance really being dynamic at the end of the day.
yeah, you know, that's another thing I always harp is like, hey, listen, like nobody is, you don't stay at the top forever. Like whatever your max is, like that was what you could do on that day. Your max is
Right.
different every single day. Whatever you deadlifted yesterday and whatever you could deadlift yesterday, your max is very, very, almost 99% sure it's different today. And I think that sometimes that conversation can help too, is being like, hey, listen, like RPE is sort of like playing around, or not playing around, but like working around what your given max is on that day. Given max is not, the same that it is on your primary day as it is on your secondary day, so on and so forth. And that's why we use RPE, because if that wasn't the case, then we would just do percentage work, because your max is the same every single day and we can predict it perfectly, but that's just not how humans work, unfortunately. I wish it was, but it's not. So yeah, that's understanding that, I think, is big, for a lot of lifters, especially maybe more inexperienced ones.
Yeah, for sure. And being okay with those fluctuations, it's like, you're still that lifter, just the timing isn't right now. And you have to be okay with that and just take what your body's giving you.
Yeah.
That's really how you're going to actually get stronger.
Exactly.
So another thing I think is interesting talking about is top versus bottom up, or sort of top down versus bottom up deadlift bracing, because I think that this is something that you'll see lifters have lots of success with either strategy. I have my own biases, but what are some scenarios when you might recommend a top down versus a bottom up strategy of bracing for a deadlifter?
So I'll start off by saying, like, if I'm teaching someone how to deadlift in person for the first time ever, I always teach them top down, because in my opinion, it's harder to teach someone to reach over and grab the bar and round their back and then get them to undo that with their hands on the bar than it is to just never put them there in the first place. So if I teach someone how to appropriately hinge first, I'm going to incorporate that into getting them to get down to the bar. We're going to use that hinge. We're going to do that RDL essentially with our body to get as far down as we can with that hinge. And then we're just going to bend the knees the rest of the way to get there. And we never round the back over. And with that being said, that's typically, as someone gets a little bit more comfortable with that, it's probably going to feel most comfortable for them to brace at the top and then just do that, grab the bar and go. So that's kind of like my bias. It's definitely how I teach people to deadlift for the first time. Now, my own bias with my own training, what I have found is, and I've found this mainly through like when I'm pulling with straps, this is something that is always annoying for me, is when it comes to bracing at the bottom of your deadlift, is like when you're rounded over, most people they don't grab the bar with a perfectly straight back and then brace and then go. They're usually kind of reaching over, grabbing the bar, their back is a little bit rounded over, they brace, and then they sort of like uncoil themselves and get into position. For me, the way I've always envisioned it and what I've always felt is like when you're rounded over, you're compressing the front side of your torso, right? Especially your stomach. You're compressing it and you're closing it off. And now it's difficult for me to feel like I have a lot of air and pressure there, which to me is probably where I want the most amount of it, because that's where I'm going to fold and that's where I'm going to want to keep that pressure to keep me from folding over, is in the front side of my body when I'm deadlifting. So if I am having a hard time getting air to push there because of the position that I'm in, when I brace and then uncoil and set myself up, I just never feel as secure. I don't feel like I have that pressure that I want against my belt, or just in general, when I'm, say, pulling with straps, or if I try to do like a bottom up kind of approach. So that's kind of my bias. I will always let the lifter kind of make that decision to some extent. If they come to me and they're already familiarized with that, I'm going to let it rock and I'm going to let them do their thing. If they ever mention something to me that makes me think they would be better off doing a top-down approach, then I'll have them try that. But it's not something I'm going to force people to do. But if I had it my way and I'm teaching you to do it from the ground up, like, I'm always going to go with that top-down approach, because I think it just leaves less room for variability and for error. And maybe it's anecdotally, but going back to the bracing thing, that's always what I found, is it just tends to work better for me with getting that pressure that I really want.
One thing is that Brad Clear talked about on the last podcast we did was Brad doesn't like people thinking when they're lifting, just like feeling out their positions and just going over things. I think a lot of times like the bottom up bracers are like overthinking a lot at the bottom spot, whereas the top down are just like, I grab the bar and I go. I think another thing is you can be more explosive with a top-down approach and create some sort of eccentric artificially with maybe a hip shoot or with just going down to the bar and you just grab and then you go as fast as you possibly can. And that can result in, maybe a little more output. Like that's how I deadlift and I always have, just kind of just like, oh, like I feel stronger kind of when I just grab the bar and I just go and I just, go down. Now, one thing about that hip shoot is like, I try to make like a big hip shoot. Like I try to like have it not be a super wide one because that can cause me to have more center mass issues and kick the bar out if it's too big. But that's generally been what I do. I also think you've had a good point with the bracing as far as like, you want to create like the smallest area we have to like put pressure into. Like that's how I hold the whole ribs down thing is important when we're teaching bracing. And if you're having your ribs up where you're messing around at the bottom, you have like less of that compression, it's harder to create that. And I think also on deadlifting, like the way we brace is different than on a squat. Like typically we're not trying to get the 360. It's more so what you said with like that front to back. And so the bracing needs to be a slightly different with how you're doing it. It's like if you have like a big 360-degree brace, you're not going to be in as good of a position at the bottom.
Yeah. Yeah, the load is not on top of you and smushing you. It's in front of you in your hands. So you kind of want to. Your goal is to, how do I maintain my position and peel this thing off the floor the best I can? And I think that makes the most sense. And what you said about the bottom up guys overthinking is like a huge thing. Like I can't tell you how often I've had lifters who, especially guys who also pull hook grip and do this too, where they're like they're at the bottom. They'll send me a single and the video is like 50 seconds long, and I'm like, you need to put like this video needs to be 10 seconds long, and the bar speed, all that stuff can be the same, but the amount of time you're sitting here getting your thumbs set and then feeling your feet in the right spot, feeling the bar distance in the right spot, you're gonna mess something up. And two, it's just like there's only so long that you can like be mentally dialed in and mentally locked in, like especially with a heavy lift, before you're just like in that zone for too long. I think it's time to do the heavy deadlift. You've got a finite amount of time of like, let's go, before it wavers and now you just are kind of zapped mentally or whatever, or you spend a minute bent over the bar, with your back rounded over and hyperventilating because you're hyped up or whatever, and then just something goes awry. So I totally agree. If I have a bottom up lifter who's like doing that, I am always like, you need to put your hands on the bar and you need to pull in less than 3 seconds. Like that's what I'm giving you once you get your hands on the bar or whatever it is. And that's a way I've kind of gone about troubleshooting that issue, if I don't want to entirely change how the lifter is approaching, the deadlift in general. So
yeah, just like the whole, just like simplifying your setup. Just like if your setup's good, you're not going to have to think about what you're doing. Like brace, pull, wedge. That's it. Like brace, like pull yourself in high of a torso position, just wedge with your hips. That's as simple as it is. Bench press. All I really think about with my lifters is like leg drive, chest high, fucking just bar to chest. That's just how you do it. Squat, you walk, you get a big brace on the walkout, you walk it out, you find your foot position, you find your brace, and you just squat that shit. It's not that hard. Like, like it gets to be like there's more to it when you get to be like stronger. As far as I do think that there is the technical curve of powerlifting goes higher as you get stronger, but the fundamental level, if you ask any of these elite guys, they're not thinking about more than that. But and then what happens is that you just learn. As you get stronger, you just learn. Oh, I need to be a little bit different with how I do blah 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 versus when I was benching 200 pounds.
Yeah, and it's like if you teach someone who's been, doing anything, if you take a pen and you put it in someone's left hand who's a righty, suddenly have to think about how to write. But if you put it in their right hand and they've been doing it for their entire life, they don't need to think about how to write. They just do it. And I think it's the same thing. There becomes this larger technical curve as you get later in the game of powerlifting and you become stronger. But the more reps that you do it right, the less of an issue that technical curve becomes, because it's just habitual and it's second nature. And I feel like that's the difference between when you go to meets and someone's walking out their squat and their coach is yelling cues at them. And then when I, not trying to be like, oh, I'm separating, I'm different or anything like that. But like when I go to a meet,
my idea is like all that shit is done already. Like I yell at them to like brace hard and just like I'm just like just sit down with it. Just sit down and stand up. Like don't think about anything else. Or like when deadlifts come around and it's their third deadlift and it's heavy, I am right before they pull it, I'm like, don't stop pulling this bar until you pass out. And if I did my job right and the attempt selection is right, they're not going to pass out. They're going to stand up with
Yep.
it. And I think just kind of clearing your head of that stuff is crucial, you know, as you get stronger. So yeah, couldn't agree more with your take on that and, you know, Brad's take on that. So yeah, as time goes on, you want the lifter to think less and less and less. And, you know, if they're spending a minute at the bar setting up, there's no chance
It's kind of like
doing less thinking.
Kind of like with our guitar playing, we're not thinking about, oh, this is an A, this is a F sharp, this is a G. I'm playing that. Oh, this is a triple. Like you're not thinking about that. You're just doing. It's just motor
Dude,
memory.
I only know numbers too. I don't even know the notes. You kidding me?
Well, Dave Grohl doesn't know anything about anything, and he's amazing. So I don't think you know a lot. You just know the language of music. But
yeah, dude, you learn a guitar tab and you could be great. So
yeah, for real, just listening. That's how I learned. But I want to thank you for coming on, Matt. If people want to, you know, sign up for Powerlifting Now, follow you, hire you, where should they head?
So you can find all of my stuff at Cronin Strength on Instagram. Powerlifting Now. Let me double check because I'm pretty sure it's powerlifting-now.com. And let me double check that. Yes, it is. Powerlifting-now.com for all your powerlifting education needs. Shameless plug. Follow us on Instagram. We post some stuff on there. And yeah, I think that's about it. And if you want to contact me, you can go to my website, croninstrength.com. There's a tab on there to contact me, to send me an email. And yeah, I think that's everything. Keep it short and sweet.
Perfect. I'll make sure I include all those details in the show notes. And thank you guys for listening. I'll talk to you guys in the next episode.